Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of the study. We're still in section E in the test specifications on lighting, and we're moving on to number 6. Number 6 says, knowledge of on-camera and off-camera flash techniques, including TTL and manual. To begin this section, I'm just going to say we're going to have a casual conversation about flash here because, frankly, when the Certification Commission removed guide numbers from the test specifications, that was an indication that we're not necessarily going to teach a full-blown flash class here. What we're really going to try to do is just to understand the basics of flash photography. It would be my opinion that it would be good for you to do a little bit deeper dive into flash operations. I actually have a great video about that I may tell you about at some point, but all we're going to talk about here really is flash as it pertains to the CPP. So I hope that's helpful to you. Let's begin by talking about flash sync. Flash sync is basically a camera element where the camera has to synchronize with the firing of the flash. So basically what happens here is that the mirror in your camera has to come up and the curtain has to move completely out of the way before the flash fires. If that sequence does not happen and the flash fires before the curtain gets out of the way, then the curtain is actually covering up part of the sensor when the flash fires, and therefore it leaves a black band on one side of the image. That is because that curtain is covering the sensor during the flash exposure. So when you see this, or that problem is known as a problem of flash sync, because the camera is not synchronized with the firing of the flash. Again, that's a product of the camera brand and the camera model. It's the camera that determines the camera's shutter speed, sync speed that has to be used with the flash. Most of them will all sync at 1/125th of a second. Some of the cameras sync at 200 or 250. And then of course there's high speed sync, which the test specifications don't mention. So we're not going to talk about that here for the purposes of CPP. But just know that sync is the shutter speed that is determined by the camera manufacturer for using that camera with the flash. Okay, so for 2018, the Certification Commission removed the concept of guide numbers out of the test specifications, which means you no longer have to calculate exposures using guide numbers. What that tells me is that in all questions pertaining to flash, there's going to be an assumed exposure that's going to be given in the question. I don't see any other way that it could be done. So what we want to do right now is to recognize that we need to be able to figure out how to produce a particular amount of light coming out of our flash at any given exposure that the test might present us. So what you want to know is that a flash has something of like a dimmer switch where you can power the flash down at various levels to create less light emanating from the flash. And so let's just begin with a look at a flash at full power. And for our purposes here, since we're not having to calculate what that power is, we're just going to say F11. Let's assume that a flash powers out at F11 based on the distance it is from the subject. What you want to be able to know is, how do I fire that flash at F11? How do I fire it at F8? How can I fire it at 5.6, 4, 2.8, and so on? When we talk in the next section about the inverse square law, we'll even talk about increasing the power of the flash. Obviously you can't make it any more powerful than it is, but you can increase the output by moving the flash closer, and we'll see that in the inverse square law conversation. So right here, let's see how we power that flash down. So at any given exposure such as F11, we can fire it at a variety of different settings if we have a flash that's capable of being powered down. Now, not all models have that, of course, but I think in the purposes of CPP, they're assuming we have access to a flash that is able to be powered down. So take a look at this chart and let's take a look at some of the things that will look a little bit familiar to us from previous conversations. When you see this ratio on the output of a flash, 1:1, that's an indication that the flash is firing at full power. Now again, we don't know what the f-stop is at full power. It depends on the distance that it is from the subject. It also depends on the zoom head position in the flash. If the flash has one of those heads that zoom back and forth to track the zoom on your lens. I think that's one of the other things that complicated the test or the exam questions for the writers of the test questions, because you would have so many different variations, because the exposure would also be based upon that zoom head position. So we're going to take that out of the equation here as well for the purposes of the CPP. So all we really want to know is, how do we make this flash at full power that's firing at f11 or f16 or whatever? How can we power that down? Well, again, let's go back to the graph. Remember, each f-stop represents twice as much light or half the amount of light. So if f11 is, let's say, full power, then half the amount of light would mean we would have to open up a stop to f8, right? So when you see these numbers on the back of your flash, it's a whole series of what appear to be ratios. But what those ratios really translate into are how many stops you're powering down that flash from full power. So take a look again. 1:1 is full power. But if you set that flash ratio setting to 1/2 power, you're reducing the output of that flash by 1 stop. If you reduce it again by 1/4 power, 1/4 power represents 2 stops. So you're powering down that flash by 2 stops. And let's move down to the bottom. Look, 1/64 power reduces the output by 6 stops. 1/128 power reduces the output by 7 stops. So again, it's kind of like having a dimmer switch. And what you want to do is be able to key in your mind how those f-stops and shutter speeds worked, like we talked in the beginning. It's either twice as much or half as much. If you go 2 stops, it's 4 times as much, or 1/4 the amount. That's all that's taking place here. Instead of saying the flash is powering down by 1 stop or 2 stops or 3 stops, the flash indicates that by how much less light is being emanated from that flash. So it's either full power, 1:1, or half power, which is 1 stop, 1/4 power, which is 2 stops. So if our test question begins with an exposure of f11, the question might say, well, what if you want that flash to fire at 5.6? You would be able to count in your head from f11 to f8 to 5.6. That's 2 stops. Well, how much is 2 stops less? Well, it's 1/4 power. The question may start with the flash firing at f22, and it would say, what would be 1/8 power? What would that f-stop be? Well, 1/8 power represents 3 stops. So we would start at 22, and we would go from 22 to 16 to 11 to 8. So our answer would be f8. Study this a little bit, memorize those f-stops and shutter speeds, and I think this section will be pretty quick and easy for you to get and to learn. In earlier lessons, we talked about the difference between a main light and a fill light. The main light's job is to illuminate the subject. The fill light's job is to control the shadows or to control the contrast. So let's take a look at portable flash as it pertains to using it as a main light or as a fill light. When you're using it as a main light, the idea is to know what the output is of the flash to the subject and set your exposure based on that output. So again, you could shoot a flash at f11 or 5.6, any output you want, by dialing down those ratio numbers or those power settings. But the trick here is to match that flash to the environment in which you're photographing. So let's take a look at this example of a bride and groom that's being photographed on their wedding day with full sun outside the church. Now, we know what kind of lighting we get when we put the subjects in full sun. It's harsh, it's hard, it's not very flattering, and I just didn't feel like that was an option in this case. So what I chose to do is to eliminate all of the shadows from the sun and then use my flash as the main light. But the trick here is we want the church in the background where they're going to be married, and it's in full sun. By moving the two of them in the shade, my goal here was to balance the flash on the subject to the lighting in the background. Now I know from the Sunny 16 rule that the lighting on the church and in the background is f16 at 125. If you don't know why that is, go back and review the Sunny 16 rule. So if the background is f16 at 125, then my goal here is to make the flash fire at approximately f16 or maybe just a little bit lower. But the trick here is to just get enough illumination on that bride and groom so that the light on them balances the lighting in the background. So a question might be formed here on the exam that says your background is in full sun. And the exposure is f16 at 125. They may give you that or they may not give you that. They may expect you to know that from the Sunny 16 rule. But then the question might ask, if your bride and groom are in full shade, what exposure would you need from your flash to balance the light to the background? Well, so we would know here that it's f16. But they could kind of wordsmith that question a little bit to say something along the lines that your flash is firing at f22. How would you get that flash firing f22 to fire at f16 to balance to the background? Well, the answer would be set it to 1/2 power. So in this image, the ambient light measures 5.6 at 125. The question might ask, what if your flash is firing at f11? How are you going to make it fire at 5.6 to balance to the ambient light? Well, the answer would be to set the flash to 1/4 power, because we need it to fire 2 stops less from f11 to 5.6, and 2 stops is 1/4 power. The test specifications specifically mention on-camera techniques and off-camera flash techniques. So it's really important to think about why we would move that flash off camera in the first place. Well, the answer would be because we want to create directional light. If you think about it, when the flash is always on the camera and always moving forward, that's producing a very flat light. And we already talked about in the earlier lessons that we want to create directional light, light that rakes across the subject. So by moving the flash off the camera, we're now able to create directional light just like we would if we were using a studio. We can put that light at 45 degrees or at 90 degrees or really anywhere we want to create our directional light. The other thing we want to consider is that we probably want to create a larger light source from our portable flash, because remember, the smaller the light source, the harder the light, and the larger the light source, the softer the light. So most of the time when you're using that flash off camera, you're probably going to want to fire it through a smaller softbox or an umbrella. I prefer a softbox because umbrellas tend to catch a lot of wind and really make it easy for the flash and stand to blow over. With the softbox, it's a little bit more wind resistant. I would still put a sandbag on the stand just to protect my flash. I certainly wouldn't want anything to happen by having the thing knocked over. But by using a softbox, we're now taking that little tiny light source from the flash and turning it into a much larger light source, therefore a much softer light source. We've already talked about the sync speed as being a product of the camera. The camera manufacturer determines the sync speed. And we know what happens if we go beyond the sync speed to a faster speed. Then we have the problems of the black lines or black areas showing up in our images. But you may not realize that you can actually use any speed slower than the sync speed. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. When it comes to flash photography, the shutter speed has no bearing on the exposure of the flash. The entire flash exposure is based upon the f-stop. It's the shutter speed that records the ambient light, and only the ambient light. So you're asking, what did you just say, Steve? Well, think about this for a second. That flash has a very short duration, maybe 1/4000th of a second or even faster. 1/4000th of a second. So if you're taking an image in a completely dark room at 1/125th of a second, when that camera shutter opens all the way and the flash fires, it's coming and going in 1/4000th of a second. That makes 1/125th of a second seem like an eternity, doesn't it? So in slow motion, you might see the shutter open completely, the flash fire, and it disappears and dissipates, and then sometime later the shutter closes. Well, if the room is completely dark, it's not recording any additional light while that shutter is open. It would be like walking into a completely dark room without a flash and taking a long shutter speed exposure. You would record nothing because there's no light in there. The shutter speed does not control the exposure of the flash. The exposure of the flash is based on the f-stop only. So, by dragging the shutter, we're now able to incorporate ambient light into our image along with our flash exposure. So if you think about this, let's say we have a room where the exposure is 1/15th of a second to record the ambient light. If we fire that camera at 1/125th of a second, that room's still going to look dark, right? Because it's going to be way underexposed. The shutter was not open nearly long enough. But by slowing down the shutter to 1/15th of a second, now we're recording ambient light. Our trick here is to figure out what the exposure is of the flash onto the subject, set the f-stop so that the flash records the subject, but then find the corresponding shutter speed that will record the ambient light at that given f-stop. That technique is called dragging the shutter. And let's take a look at an example here. The bride and groom inside the church, I took it at f11 at 125. The exposure on the bride and groom looked great. That's because f11 was the output of the flash. But it left the church looking something like Carlsbad Caverns, really dark back there. What I would really like to have is some detail in the background so that I could pick up some elements of the church. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to find an ambient light exposure of the church. By taking my handheld meter to the back of the church and just recording the ambient light, I found the exposure was 2.8 at 1/15th of a second. So with my flash firing at f11, I have to figure out, how do I make that flash fire at 2.8 instead of f11? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to count. So f11 to f8 is 1 stop, to 5/6 is 2 stops, to 4 is 3 stops, to 2.8 is 4 stops. What I need to be able to do is power down my flash by 4 stops. How am I going to do that? I'm going to go to those power settings, those ratios. 1:1 was full power at f11. Half power gave me f8. A quarter power gave me 5/6. 1/8 power gave me f4. And 1/16 power gave me 2.8. Now I can fire my flash at 2.8, set my lens to 2.8, and record a proper exposure of the bride and groom. But if I leave my shutter speed on 1/125th of a second, then the church is still going to be quite dark, because remember, the ambient light said 2.8 at a 15th. Again, I can use any shutter speed I want that's slower than the sync speed, so I'm going to move from 1/125th of a second down to 1/15th of a second to record the ambient light. 2.8 at 1/15th records the ambient light. And my flash is also firing at 2.8 because it's at 1/16th power. That's the overall look at how to take an image using the technique known as dragging the shutter. You can actually control the intensity of the background with the shutter speed. In this example, if I speed the shutter up by 1 stop, then the background gets a little bit darker. If I slow the shutter down by 1 stop, then the background gets a little bit brighter. So photographers love this technique because you set the proper exposure based upon the flash and the f-stops, and you control the background through the shutter speed. Now let's talk a moment about bounce flash. Again, it's a little bit of a difficult conversation to have since we're not using guide numbers anymore with the test specifications. But the idea about bounce flash is to just know the basics. With bounce flash, generally, you're increasing the distance that the flash has to travel, therefore reducing the overall output of the flash. So for example, if I have a subject that's 10 feet away and I'm pointing my flash directly at the subject, then that light's pretty efficient at reaching the subject at only 10 feet. If instead I take that flash and turn it up towards the ceiling, and let's say we have a 12-foot ceiling, well, now the flash has to travel up to the ceiling and then back down to reach the subject. That's going to increase the distance that was 10 feet to maybe as much as 14 or 16 feet. So we know by its nature that we're going to have less efficiency from the flash when we bounce it. We're going to have to compensate with the f-stop for the amount of light loss by that distance traveled. Furthermore, the bounce flash technique indicates to us that we also have to open up the lens by 1 or 2 additional stops just to make up for the light absorption from the ceiling surface. So if you have a dull matte ceiling, then it's going to be far less efficient at returning the light back down onto the subject than, let's say, a highly polished or highly reflective type of ceiling would. So in our bounce flash scenarios, what we know is that the output forward is the most efficient, the most intense, but if we're bouncing it off the ceiling, we're going to have to open up a stop or so just because of the increased distance. It really depends on the ceiling height. And then furthermore, we're going to have to open up an additional 1 or 2 stops to compensate for the lack of efficiency of the surface that we're bouncing off of. So for that reason, when you have a worded question about bounce flash, there's probably going to be some sort of indication that the flash output is any given f-stop. Let's say f8. But if we're going to bounce flash, in your mind, you want to recognize that we're probably going to have to open up an additional stop or 2 from that answer. So f8 would appear more like 5, 6, or f4. Again, I haven't seen the test ask these questions since we've made changes and taken the guide numbers off. But my suspicion is, if there's questions on this at all, you want to migrate towards an answer that represents a larger lens opening. So the question could be, in a bounce flash scenario, which would be the most likely f-stop that you would use? f22, f16, f11, or F4? I would choose F4 because, again, I'm making those assumptions that because I'm bouncing, light's traveling further. That's going to cost me at least one stop, maybe more, and I'm going to have to open up an additional stop or two. So there's 3 stops less in the formula of calculating bounce flash. I really like bounce flash as a technique. It creates such a nice soft quality of light and gets rid of the really harsh shadows that the direct flash would normally give us. Why is it so much softer? Well, because with that direct flash, it's a little bitty light source. But if I'm bouncing that flash off of a ceiling or off of a wall, I'm creating a much larger light source, therefore a much softer quality of light. I am such an advocate of using my flash in manual. I shoot it in manual 100% of the time. With a little bit of practice, you can dominate that flash and make it do anything that you want it to do because you're able to power it down to produce any f-stop that you want. But some photographers elect to use the TTL features of the flash. TTL meaning through the lens, which simply is a way of saying that the exposure when using a flash is decided upon by measuring the light striking through the lens. And the camera does this internally so that when it gets to a certain exposure or a certain derived exposure, it powers off the flash or powers it down and kind of does the dialing down for you. The problem with this for me is that it's always guesswork. You're always trying to hope that the camera and the flash can work together to find the proper exposure. I kind of believe that that almost never happens. Why? Because it's still using 18% gray as its standard for exposure. And we've already seen how terrible the in-camera meters work at determining the proper exposure. They're measuring reflected light, right? What we really want is that ambient light. We want the light falling on the subject. And so by shooting in manual, we can always measure the light falling on the subject with our meter. But with TTL, the camera is going to use its internal meter to determine what the output of the flash should be, and it's going to establish it at an 18% gray point. Therefore, you as the photographer always have to make adjustments to your exposure by either using exposure compensation to either underexpose or overexposed based upon what ETTL is giving you. If the image is too dark, we increase the exposure. If the image is too light, we decrease the exposure by using exposure compensation. Personally, I like manual because it's the ultimate in exposure compensation, and firing the flash in manual mode means it doesn't matter what the subject's wearing. It could be darks, it could be lights. You always know what the output of the flash is going to be in manual. But with TTL, it's going to react differently when someone's wearing light colored clothing versus when they're wearing dark colored clothing. And you're going to have to constantly be making those exposure compensations to compensate for the lack of accuracy of TTL. That's just my opinion. I know a lot of people teach and preach and swear by ETTL and TTL. Not me. I would rather have complete command over the equipment I'm operating. Well, that's the end of this study. It was kind of a long one. Stay tuned and we'll be on to section F.